So, welcome everyone to this Task podcast. I'm delighted to have with us Michael Harvey, Michael DB Harvey, as his writing name, who's an organizational psychologist, political ecologist, and former technology entrepreneur based in London. Michael's the author of one of my favorite books for people interested in therapy and social change, Utopia and the Anthropocene. But what we're going to focus on in this podcast is Michael's latest book, which came out in 2024, The Age of Humachines. I love that Michael's got some wonderful language that we'll come on to. Big Tech and the Battle for Humanity's Future. The Age of Humachines. Michael, tell us what the big idea is. What's the kind of, would you say, the main theme behind the book? And maybe what are humachines, just to kind of kick us off?
Okay, well, the big idea, I think, is very, very big, and perhaps there's hardly ever been a bigger one in the history of humanity, and that is that we're going through a period in which machines are being humanized, and humans are potentially being mechanized to a point where it becomes increasingly difficult to tell humans apart from technology. This is a process which has been going on, really, you might say, for at least the past 400 years, certainly through the Industrial Revolution, but I think really kicked off in the year 2000, shortly after the dot-com crash, when there was an awful lot of pressure put on technology companies to start delivering for capital and stop being simply research companies. And the most obvious one was Google, which suddenly exploded from being a research company which said it didn't want to have anything to do with advertising, to a company that's completely reinvented the whole notion of advertising, which couldn't be more central to what capitalism is, and has subsequently become a $2 trillion company. So humachines I really define in 5 categories in the book: cognitive, relational, robotic, the mechanized human or mechan, and the humachinated environment, in which all of these different types of humachine come together in something which I think is still a way off, but it's a kind of bio-digital robotic reality.
So Michael, there's so much there already, and I just come in. Take us through those again and explain what each of those different ones are.
Well, let me start with cognitive humachines, because in a way, that's what people, I think, are most familiar with, because this is basically trying to find ways of replicating what humans do cognitively in terms of reasoning, decision-making, planning, reading, and so on. And it's commonly known as AI. So AI is, most people are now pretty familiar with it, because over the past couple of years, we've had generative AI, which is making its way into virtually everyone's life these days.
Okay, so that was the first one. And then the second
one? Process, a kind of history, which started way back in the 1950s, when a group of data scientists in America got together and said, why don't we replicate the human brain? And the idea was being, well, the brain is probably a bit like a computer anyway, so it ought to be quite easy to do that. They thought it would take a couple of months. It was a summer vacation, and basically they're still trying to put that together, and none of the tasks they set themselves have actually been achieved. But that process is moving towards what's called AGI, artificial general intelligence, or super intelligence. And some of the leading people in this field think that this is just about to happen. It was for a long time, this was thought to be something that would happen in the late 2040s, but now people like Ray Kurzweil, who's a leading visionary in this field, people like Elon Musk, are now suggesting that this point where there's some intelligence of humanity is superseded by the power of a cheap computer can happen in 2029, or maybe even this year or next year.
Okay, so that's the first one, Michael. Just take us through the other ones, and then we'll come back.
So the other areas are emotional humachines, which basically are trying to read our emotions, essentially through eye movements, through stress, through biomedical data, the kind of things therapists tend to be pretty good at without requiring any technology. But it's something which is getting more and more important. It's happening a lot in gaming, where sort of total interactive systems. It's even said that this kind of technology will replace lie detectors and will be extremely good, maybe 99% accurate in deciding whether we're telling the truth or not. And it's already being used, in various types of job interviews or in border situations, interviewing potential asylum seekers and so on. So that's emotional humachines. Relational humachines really much more familiar in a sense that they include communicative humachines, like the kind of thing we're doing now. Again, a whole revolution which has occurred in terms of text, data, emails, and so on. Now it's moving on to AI assistants, AI agents who are going to be giving us advice, planning out our day potentially. We're looking at AI newscasters, incredibly convincing. So it's a whole kind of system which is basically changing in quite fundamental ways the way we communicate with each other, we relate to one another. And that takes us to Humachine 4, which is kind of the big one, in some ways the most dramatic. And I think the first part, which is the mechanization of human beings. This goes beyond robotics. Sorry, I missed out the third one, and I should put that in. So robotic humachines, basically, easy to understand. It's basically trying to replace a whole series of human functions, like in the way in which we relate to each other in terms of work, in terms of how we care for each other, how we care for the old, how we care for the sick, how we care for the young, new forms of parenting, new forms of teaching, all of which can be done either by digital systems or by humanoid robots. And robots is, the big thing, I think, which is taking off in what you might say the second age of humachines, the second quarter of the 21st century. There are predictions. Citigroup has just come up with this prediction that by 2035, there will be 1.3 billion robots out there. Most of these industrial robots involved in the supply chain, not simply in the factory system where they've been for quite a long time, but in the entire supply chain, retail, and so on. But also by 2050, the prediction is that it'll be something like a third of a billion humanoid robots. So this is where you're encroaching more and more into that kind of human territory. These are robots that not only can do physically the motor skills, things that humans are good at, but actually have AI which enable them to talk, communicate, read our emotions, and so on. And that's a huge area. I mean, Tesla, for example, much in the news at the moment, has rebranded itself in some ways as a robotics company. And when you think about something like a self-driving car, this is basically a robot. It's a robot you can get inside.
So Michael, you were saying about robotics, and then is humanization, is that the final stage that you're writing about?
Well, I think let me get on to the fourth point briefly,
Yep.
which is the most dramatic, because this is the point where, in a sense, technology and the human brain and body come together. The main idea for people like Elon Musk of how you actually create superintelligence or use it for human purposes is basically by putting it inside the human brain. And he already has a well-funded company called Neuralink, which is already doing this. It's enabled people, severely paralyzed people, to regain some of their functions, but that's simply the start of a process which is meant to put the power of increasing information processing actually inside our brains, to perhaps the point where 90% of our brain is computerized. And at the same time, we're looking at artificial organs. Again, this is something like a 30 billion industry which is developing. The artificial heart is already used by some people, not for very long, but for something, anything up to about 6 months. People are surviving with artificial hearts, artificial kidneys, artificial lungs, artificial skin. And the idea behind this, with the theorists, is that medical death is unnecessary. In other words, we ought to be able to replace virtually everything that we think of as the brain and body. We can have nano medicine, tiny nano robots actually inside our bodies, replacing, monitoring our health. And in this way, it should be possible to live for hundreds of years. So, that's
so, Michael, we can come back
to.
So we'll come back to some of the kind of challenges and problems. What's the fifth and the final form that you write about?
I think the fifth is the hardest to understand, because it's trying to envisage a situation where all of these four elements come together, where you're living in an environment where you have robots, you have digital systems, and not simply systems that are in your phone or your laptop, but are built into the walls and ceilings of your houses through material science. Our kind of every surface, in a sense, is live, is electronic, is kind of both watching you, interacting you, responding to you, and both in theory. So you want to change the color of your car, you change it. It maybe senses your mood sufficiently to start changing. And we're seeing this in the smart house, the smart city, the smart workplace, extending out to the smart universe, and ultimately the smart space colony, and everywhere in between. So it's just about as big as you can possibly get.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, it's really helpful just to kind of map out those different realms. I guess the key question then would be, and so what, in a sense? Like, you were talking about artificial hearts and artificial kidneys, which obviously, I guess, could be a positive thing. I'm also thinking that, say, from a kind of Marxist perspective, the tools that we use in the means of production, this is just another phase of development, of kind of social development, in terms of kind of technological determinism in some way. But I know for you that and I think you've hinted at this already, and I guess it links with how you see the role of capital in this, that you see this process of humanization as fundamentally problematic.
So I'm just losing you there, mate.
Sorry, I was saying that I think you see the process of humanization as fundamentally problematic. You don't see it as a kind of neutral.
No. I mean, I think in the end, what we're looking at is this extraordinary reinvention by capitalism of itself as something which goes beyond changing human beings in terms of the political economy, in terms of social relations, in terms of the way that has always happened over the past 200 or 300 years, but fundamentally to change the meaning of being human on planet Earth into something which is totally technologized, essentially a new kind of human race, sometimes called transhumanist, or in which this something that could be seen is presented as a kind of techno-utopia, which could transform everybody's life, and in theory could, if you believe in the total trickle down theory, but is much more likely to benefit those who already have the most already, those who are already investing heavily in anti-aging treatments and so on. So creating this kind of super techno elite, which then kind of dominates to an even greater extent more this new kind of social pyramid. And the key in all of this, I think, is, well, probably one of the keys is job automation, is the way in which job automation, all of this AI, the robotics and so on, is there to stimulate supposedly economic growth. And it is, in a sense, I think, a recognition in some ways that economic growth is fading, is deeply problematic. Certainly in Europe, it's almost disappearing. And we're seeing, our current government in this country, the Labour government, virtually betting the farm on AI now as the only way in which we could possibly rediscover the economic growth, which has more or less disappeared from our economy since the 2008 crash. So this is, in some ways, the logical way for capitalism to go. It is to totally prioritize the role of capital, so that labor almost becomes immaterial. It's something which can be done much more effectively and much more cheaply by machines. And so that in many ways is the key area of what happens, to what extent is this accepted? To what extent do we, progressives and others, people working, go along with this idea, which has now become, without any real discussion or debate, more or less accepted, it seems, as basically the next phase of capitalism and the kind of next phase of neoliberal economics, without ever really being talked about.
Yeah, sorry, Michael. I mean, if you look at the work, I think it's Aaron Bastani on fully automated communism.
Yeah.
He would argue that the AI and technology will free us up for leisure, and it will allow, as you say, the development of some more utopian society and allow for the possibility of a fairer society. But it sounds like you're taking an opposite view, which is actually that the development of AI leads to increasing infiltration of our very being by capital, and will permeate us with the impossibility of ever escaping from that hierarchical oppressive system. Would that be right?
Yeah. I mean, I am quite critical, I think, of yes, the sort of fully automated luxury communism idea, or other people putting forward a kind of leftist accelerationism, as it's called, and that's always been quite a dream, in a sense, of the left. And yes, it's one of those things. If you could imagine a kind of totally successful, fully functioning socialist state, which has kind of solved all the problems that Soviet socialism come across, wasn't just a new kind of hierarchy, then you could say possibly there could come a time when you start thinking, well, we've achieved so much in terms of egalitarian. We've solved the climate problem. We've created a sustainable world. How can we kind of add to that through machines? But we're not there. And I think the idea that somehow you can kind of ride shotgun on big tech and at some point steer it in a completely different direction, by which it has so much control over absolutely everything, I think is just pie in the sky. And I think Bastani in particular does swallow whole, I think, an awful lot of kind of big tech myths about free energy and so on, of what what this kind of technology can actually do. I mean, we know, for example, that the AI is already consuming huge amounts of energy. The more we move to AGI, the more we're going to get massive amounts of energy, which will be required just to keep AI going. I mean, AI tends to be just thought of as something in the cloud, that wonderful euphemism for what are basically huge warehouses with massive server, basically machines. AGI has been described as magic intelligence in the sky. But because it isn't in the sky, it's grounded, it's being pumped up by machines. So I just take that as one kind of problematic area. And I'd say another problematic area, but I think maybe we can come to talk about, is this fundamental myth, the brain-computer myth, which I think is at the heart of so much of this, which suggests that somehow it's unproblematic to mechanize human beings. Yes, if you think the brain is basically a computer, a piece of software, which is running a body, which is essentially hardware. If you think of the human genome or the genetic code as again being software, then why not reprogram it? Because of personal eugenics and human cloning is again part of this whole human-machine imaginary. But that for me is a complete and utter sort of mechanistic myth. Yes, it's got a long heritage going back to Descartes and Hobbes and the beginning of the Western science revolution. But it is, in fact, I think, a kind of terrible calumny against the human brain, which we know, one of the things we know about it, it's the most complicated organ or complicated entity in the universe. And in fact, what we understand about the human brain at the moment is extraordinarily limited. There's a marvelous book by a guy called Matthew Cobb, which is called The History of the Brain. And he's actually a biologist working on very, very simple kind of organisms. He thinks that we won't understand the way in which even the simplest, worm-like brains operate until probably the end of the century.
So are you saying, Michael, that it's far too premature to be using technology and AI as a way of emulating the human brain without understanding it's kind of imposing on it a particular structure? Do you see then AI as is part of your concern about a fundamental dehumanization of human being?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're looking at is both a kind of capitalization of everything, the kind of final frontier for capital, to turn everything that humans are into a source of capital. And we've already seen this to some extent with the datafication of everything, where another kind of humanization in which all of our data is kind of sucked out of us, used by social media, used by all of the systems that we employ in order to build up this data picture of us, which enables big tech to more accurately predict our consumer and even political choices. So yes, it's an incredibly powerful system for, yes, rehumanizing or dehumanizing us in a way which is powerful for capital. But at the same time, it is also, you have to say, a scientific vision. And it's two kind of things coming together. It's a tradition mainly in physics, which yes goes back to Newton, goes back to Kepler, the whole revelation, if you remember, of Kepler and others thinking, hey, the universe is not some sort of ineffable, deeply mysterious organism presided over by a god you can never understand, but hey, it's much more like a clockwork, and God is a kind of watchmaker And on that basis, you think if it's a clockwork, well, we can take it apart. And ultimately, we can understand it and re-engineer it. And so this is a very, very strong tradition, essentially, that has been going in science for 300 or 400 years. And it's only really now in the 21st century, or certainly with the computer and computer science, which is the absolute heart of all the big tech are doing, that you suddenly think, yes, it seems to be possible with the digitalization of everything to mechanize everything by understanding and breaking it down into digital structures and then restructuring it. So in a way, it's more than just a problem with capitalism. It's a problem, I think, in science with this kind of potential split, I think, between this physics-based ultra science, which sees no limits really to where it can go, beyond what it is to be human, beyond what the Earth, beyond the solar system, into infinity, as a kind of duty of what scientists do. On the other hand, I think we have a much more biological tradition, life sciences, a much more integrated way of thinking of nature, not as something there to be mastered and overcome, but as who we are. Again, not a dualistic split between humans and nature, which is very much part of that mechanistic physics tradition, but seeing, yes, we are all part of nature, and how can we understand nature in a way that makes it clear, which opens up better ways to be human than somehow to turn us into machines.
And I guess what you'd see in that latter camp is some of our more kind of humanistic models of therapy, the work of Carl Rogers, ideas of actualization and the organism, kind of non-mechanistic, or the existential approaches, which would see that see the human being in a very different way, and we'd be very wary. In a sense, your project is an existential one, like all great existentialists, of trying to kind of save humanity and the uniqueness and the variability of humanity from a kind of mechanistic, scientific, deterministic worldview. But I wanted to ask you, Michael, about what do you see as driving big tech? I mean, maybe it's an easy answer or an obvious answer, which is capital. Okay, but what is it behind the capital? Is it individuals? Is it what are the forces behind that? Do you see that as a kind of individual social level? Yeah, what's your sense of that?
Well, I think that there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot in there. I mean, I think to some extent you can understand a lot of what's happening with big tech in terms of computer science. This discipline, which is now one of the most popular, I think it's become the most popular academic area in this country and around the world. It only started to exist really as an academic discipline in the 1970s. And what's interesting, I think, if you look at all of the big tech titans, people like Page and Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, Elon Musk, and so on, and all of them have formally studied computer science. In fact, Larry Page's dad was one of the first computer science professors. They've not only studied it, but they've kind of absorbed it almost from birth in many cases. Playing around with learning new computer languages for fun, playing with computer games, and of course reading fairly obsessively in many cases science fiction. Jeff Bezos, for example, is well known as a kind of Star Trek freak. I think he even paid to be in Star Trek. He sees his whole mission not really anything to do with Amazon, but to do with Blue Origin, his space mission. That's what he's dedicating himself to do. And he said, I see myself as a builder, essentially putting into practice all of those brilliant ideas that science fiction came up with in the 20th century. And so this is an incredibly strong imaginary, which is kind of driving people. Yes, they want to make money, but some of them aren't actually that interested in money per se. They're interested in the power that comes with it. So you have this kind of scientific aspect where computer science, as I tried to explain, I think has always had that idea of sort of AGI, or artificial general intelligence, being almost its mission. So, if you are into computer science, you're into this idea that it is possible and perhaps necessary to come up with artificial intelligence, which fundamentally is thousands of times, maybe millions of times more intelligent than anything that humans can come up with. And that, for me, is in itself is incredibly dangerous. It's sort of accepted of, hey, that would be useful, wouldn't it? But I mean, what would that be like? I mean, how would we understand it? We wouldn't have a clue what an entity which is thousands of times or millions of times more intelligent than us is doing, and what it intends to do. Would it be like a benevolent God, a malevolent God, or what? And one thing that's sure about, or that isn't discussed in any way, how would this be democratized? Who would own this? And of course, the answer at the moment is absolutely clear: big tech. 5 or 6 companies which own the large language models, which increasingly even academics don't have access to. So,
Michael, sorry to interrupt. Can I just bring you back to something? Because when you're describing this kind of drive is coming from science and imaginary and Star Trek, that's almost quite a kind of benign model. It certainly contrasts with a kind of drive towards capital, greed, people making, it being about money and ultimately about kind of capitalism. I mean, do you see both of these forces at play, or do you ultimately see that actually there's something more kind of psychological, more personal in what's driving what, as you're saying, whether it's dangerous or not, the intention behind it? Do you see it as benign, or do you feel that it is, in the way that Marx and other socialists have described it, ultimately this kind of steamroller force of capitalism that is underpinned by maybe greed or some other human need?
Yeah, I think it is. Well, I mean, I think it is kind of the logical next step in capitalism to simply go beyond humans. So I mean, and that in itself.
Why?
Well, because capital needs some way of creating economic growth, which up to now has been, in many ways, I think, as a degrowther, I would say, has been very dependent on fossil fuel, on the extraordinary kind of expansive power of coal and oil and gas. And that, of course, has become increasingly problematic, both in terms of, well, to some extent, supplies running out, but also in terms of the devastating effects which using this fossil fuel technology has on the planet. So there is a very, very strong desire to have something which goes beyond this. And of course, the technology is not just based on humans, it's also geoengineering. It's fundamentally re-engineering the planet as well. I mean, I think in terms of the ultimate destiny, I mean, I think in one sense, I think the first 25 years of the Age of Humachines has been probably more benign in the sense of its effects. There are some people who are suffering horribly. I think the so-called micro workers, people around the world who are paid tiny sums to work on data. Simply like you get paid 1 cent or something to identify, is there a cat in that picture? And a lot of what is happening is based on this new kind of underclass. But I think the real kind of devastating effects of this are now happening, will happen probably in the second phase of the age of Humachines over the next 25 years. The foundations have been laid as we see more and more job automation, more and more jobs disappearing, professional middle-ranking jobs as well as lower-paid jobs, more and more of a concentration of power just at the top among the tech elite. So that I think is where we're beginning to see some of that. Of course, we're also seeing, in a way, the geopolitics, which is now kind of changing. We're beginning to get the emergence of this kind of China, America superpower restructuring, essentially based around big tech, based around who owns the data. And I think this is one way in which we're going to see the kind of splitting up of the world. I mean, Trump is already doing it. He's already warning Europe, you need to go on your own, which is actually possibly an opportunity for Europe, maybe to develop a very, very different way of doing technology. But the danger is, yes, that we will get these massive superpowers, and we get two kinds of in a sense, American authoritarianism, based on a complete control of people's lives through surveillance techniques. Again, this is already happening. Shutting down demonstrations, by identifying people through facial recognition. So this is happening on the one sense in a kind of free speech area of people like Peter Thiel, who is one of the most powerful kind of big tech people who maybe most people haven't heard of. He owns this company called Palantir, which is basically a surveillance data mining system which offers governments automated surveillance and administration systems. Palantir also, by the way, now owns much of our data in the NHS because they managed to get the contract to do that.
So do you think, Michael, sorry to interrupt you, do you think humanization then pushes us towards growing inequalities? It sounds like you do. And in terms of social justice issues, it sounds like you feel that it will lead to more and more inequalities between those who have and those who have not. And that we're just seeing the beginnings of that. And that growing inequality is actually going to get worse in the future until there will be an even greater divide between those with and those without.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's already happening. We've seen across this century a dramatic disequalization as we're getting the 1% now, I think, owns as much as 95% of humanity. And where we've had any kind of growth, almost all of the proceeds of that are going to the top elite. And the top elite now increasingly are big tech titans. I think 8 of the richest people in the world are in big tech. And we're also seeing this tech elite of software engineers who themselves are earning huge salaries. So yes, I think that's definitely the way the whole process will go towards kind of shoring up this very, very steep economic pyramid, and even perhaps going beyond what we think of as capitalism to just some kind of techno dystopia.
And what would that look like, Michael, that techno dystopia?
Well, I think it wouldn't look very pleasant because apart from anything else, big tech is kind of interfering with whatever kind of climate action is actually taking place. I mean, it claims to be quite green, claims to be eco-friendly, but there are all sorts of ways in which big tech is kind of collaborating with what you might call brown capitalism, fossil fuel capitalism, which is actually, going stronger than ever. It's certainly masking it, because if you buy the kind of technologism idea that technology can solve absolutely everything. Why bother anyway about reducing emissions, because you can geoengineer everything. So yeah, I mean, I think that we are moving towards something which is potentially maybe post-capitalist in one sense, post-growth, but it will look pretty awful, I think, in terms of some kind of fortress state in which technology is used to control people in a way in which, yes, kind of 1984 style, but 1984 style with a technology which is absolutely unbelievable in terms of its intrusiveness, in terms of its ways of knowing exactly who we are, because everything in the smart home, let alone the smart brain, it is going to be surveying you, it is going to be checking you, and is going to be making sure that you don't do anything to disrupt the system. Now, to some extent, we've talked about the American version of that. The Chinese version of techno-authoritarianism is already, far further advanced in terms of a massive kind of surveillance system, internet censorship, this social credit system, which in which even if you get a sort of parking fine or something like that, you can be banned, prevented from doing certain things like buying a train ticket or going to a concert or something. And of course, any kind of political infringements that you might make or going to a demonstration or anything like that can have much more serious repercussions. So, you can see that kind of world where, yes, if you play along, maybe you can get by, but for a lot of people, it will be miserable. And the question, of course, is what's the reaction to that? What is there an opportunity in some ways for people who are reacting to this? And job automation will probably be the catalyst. That's where people now, I think now need to start thinking very, very seriously about some kind of resistance to what's happening, to the potential job. We're seeing it now. Civil service, 30,000 jobs are supposed to be going. 30,000 jobs are going from NHS England, which is being wrapped up. We're seeing many more jobs which are now supposed to be automated or at least got rid of in the UK civil service. And of course, we're seeing Musk with his chainsaw eliminating potentially millions of jobs. Now, that's not necessarily automation yet. That's just cutting, and it's also destroying the government agencies which make any kind of regulation possible. And the biggest danger in all of this is that we have the continuation of deregulation of big tech, which is what it's thrived on over the past 25 years.
Michael, I want to come back in a sec to like what we can do and what changes what it means practically. I think it'd be interesting to explore that a bit. Can I just ask you something though? So, in this kind of dystopian vision you have of technology, I was thinking about that in contrast when I did my book. One of the chapters in that is a kind of fictional chapter, this kind of utopian society where, which is very technological, where things are run with technology and people have kind of implants where they're kind of communicating with each other and making decisions democratically about how things go in society. I guess from your perspective, you would see that as pretty naive and kind of missing where technology, and that's fine if it is, perhaps it is very naive, but I think you would see more of a malevolent driver behind technology, or do you think there is a possibility for technology? I mean, I guess somebody might argue that technology can serve both good and ill. It depends who's got control of it.
Yeah.
I think you would see it as inherently being run by big tech, by in the interest of capitalism. Would that be right?
Well, I mean, but I love your chapter, by the way, on utopia. I think it's brilliant. And well, I mean, I think in some ways technology is neutral, yes. I mean, I certainly don't buy into technologism or technological determinism, which says there's nothing you can do, you just move from one invention to the next. That's the biggest danger that we have. I think we always need to be thinking of technology in political terms. We always need to be thinking the technology we have tends to be controlled by the elite. Indeed, elites are defined almost by the technology they have, the technology they use, and of course in some cases the technologies they ban. Because some areas, like for example, famously Chinese emperors in the Ming era, banned fireworks from being used for anything other than recreational purposes, because they didn't like the idea of all their nobles blowing each other's up, which of course exactly what happened when it went to Europe. So throughout, we've always had this relationship between elites and technology, and before the agriculture, the first agricultural revolution about 9,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer communities dominated with very sophisticated levels of technology in many senses, and certainly brilliant skills at using this technology. But in many cases, these were extremely egalitarian communities in which all decisions, were made collectively, and you can imagine lots of situations which people said, look, hang on, there's that agricultural thing, maybe we should do that, or maybe we should do that full time, because some hunter-gatherer communities may have been doing horticultural or agricultural, maybe in the winter season. But then, people will say, no, we don't want to change our lives. We don't want to be working in fields all the time. We don't want to be tied down in that way. So I think there's always been a sense in which human beings are potentially the people who decide on the technology. The trouble is we do have this pyramid society ever since the agricultural. We have the elite running absolutely everything, and even in democratic periods, which we're in now, yes, it's better than them. But where is the democracy around all of the things we're talking about? Where is even the publicity? I mean, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, is that these things are happening. This is a very powerful intentionality, which has this extraordinary kind of compelling theory, but also, practical logic, and nobody's really talking about it. You'd think we're having these kind of discussions all the time. And to go to your point about, yes, could these things be used benignly? Yes, potentially. But I think, you've got to put the cart before the horse, or rather the horse before the cart. What we need is a different type of society. It has to be sustainable. Otherwise, we're totally screwed anyway. And that, of course, is a massive change. That's a massive change. And that's the end of capitalism. I think it's the end of growth. It means a massive reduction in consumption and production. We need to create much greater equality. We need, as you, I think, rightly write about in your book, we need a much greater emphasis on well-being. And all of those things mean, a complete jettisoning of our current neoclassical economic system, of neoliberalism. That is a fundamental revolution. And then
Michael,
can I just say, we then need to just this minor element as well. We need to do that on a planet-wide basis. Now, having done that, or having created some kind of world in which I think could be a wonderful world, in which we're integrated with it. Yes, we have technology. It may not be that very much AI. It may the levels of energy that degrowth economists think about is may be comparable to Western Europe in the 1970s, something like that. Who knows? There may be more. There will be the internet, but there probably won't be AI. So we will have a kind of world which is much more egalitarian, which is much more diverse, where people, I think, still work. I'm much more in favor of like the 20-hour week than maybe UBI, because I think that.
Just say what UBI is, Michael.
Well, I think universal basic income. So So some people see this as maybe the best policy in relation to big tech, to say, okay, let's have a robot tax, or if you want to automate, yes, you're going to have to pay for it by providing much more money, which will then be paid to everybody, everyone in society, unconditionally, so that people then have the choice if they want to work or work part-time, or simply engage in community activities and so on. And I think it's a great idea. I think the danger is it totally puts big tech in even more powerful position.
So where do you think people's focus should be? Do you think people's focus should be on the economic system, on welfare, or for instance, or do you think the focus should be more in challenging, tackling big tech? Do you think we should not be using things like AI? Is it about boycotting it? What do we need to do from your perspective?
Well, I'm tempted to say kind of all of those. And this is the difficulty, in a sense, is the focus. I mean, I think there has to be a continued massive focus around climate and climate change, and I think I think big tech needs to be more and more held to account in terms of what it's doing, both in terms of how real it is, how Google or Amazon with their net zero plans. I think some of that you have to look at with a pinch of salt, but also in the way in which they're creating a new kind of extractivist industry, a new kind of looking for all the kind of minerals and lithium and so on, which is required for renewables. And so we're getting it's like fossil fuel extractivism all over again. But we've seen it in Ukraine, for example. Like Trump suddenly getting interested in all Ukraine's critical minerals. No doubt at Musk's prompting. So I think that sustainability needs to be worked on. I think equitability, yes. I think we desperately need to be starting to flattening the pyramid. Wealth tax is thinking more about maybe even wage ratios, the kind of wage ratios which some cooperatives have. I think maybe 5-to-1 between the top earner and the bottom area, as opposed to the hundreds and hundreds to one which we have at the moment. Those are things which I think we need to be thinking, as an organizational psychologist, I would say this, we need to be thinking much more about organizations which are non-hierarchical, which are cooperative. In some ways, that's the biggest change of all, and the most difficult one. It's the one, well, I wouldn't say we've never tried it, but because there have been more flatter organizations throughout history, but it's certainly the assumptions that any organization that's at all efficient is going to be hierarchical needs to be massively challenged. And having worked in dozens and dozens of steeply stacked organizations with their hundreds of difference of grades, I know what that's like. We all know what it's like. But that in some ways is almost the biggest challenge, to start thinking in terms of flatter horizontal organizations in which we have democratic decisions. I think democratic decisions are what I call demo techniques for big tech, for all technology decisions. I think we desperately need participatory democracy, assemblies, jury type systems where people are discussing these issues.
And Michael, what about
go ahead.
Sorry, Michael. And what about our relationship to technology itself? Do you think that, in terms of our use, going back to the question at a very practical level, do you think we should be very selective? Do you think we should not be using AI?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's incredibly tempting. And there's no doubt about it. I mean, certainly things like summarizing, and increasingly it's getting quite difficult to avoid it. I mean, Google search now, as you probably know, Google search gives you, instead of just taking you off to a particular website or series of websites, does it for you. So I think resisting some of that is important, but I also think we do need to start thinking in terms of campaigns. There is a campaign to stop AGI, to pause AGI. These things are important. It may be possible to pause generative AI, this predictive system, which has been going now for 2.5 years, but it's already changing so much. We're beginning to see individual campaigns starting. For example, there's a campaign in the music industry, which is quite well publicized. People like Paul McCartney and Kate Bush and many others saying, stop using our material, stop sucking up all our data and then using it for apps. With this system, which the government is proposing, where you actually have, as a creator, you have to opt in rather than automatically opting out. I'm a songwriter. I've got some songs on Spotify and so on, and I don't think I'm making any money, but I don't particularly like the idea that if I was to prevent that being used, I would have to actually I think probably identify all of these different companies and say, oh, by the way, please do not use my data. These are small campaigns, and they're starting, you might say they're kind of self-interested professional ones. But I think there are bigger ones which need to be saying, why don't we stop this entire development before we can discuss these things, before we decide on them? And that's going to be incredibly important. Incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging, but I think we need to be looking at job automation, certainly, which is the big one. This is the one where everyone is affected. And, there are all sorts of myths, I think, being told about that, like robotics. We're constantly being told, the robots are only going to replace dirty, dangerous, or dull jobs. Well, then that's true. That's not true. They're replacing every single kind of job you can think of. Do you think of parenting as a dull job? Do you think of teaching as a dull job, or indeed, being a therapist? Because they're coming for every kind of job.
Well, I was going to ask,
coming for jobs that don't even exist yet. So yes, I think it's about trying to focus on the job you have, and starting to think, how do I protect that? How do I prevent any kind of
Do you think that, well, I had a couple of questions around kind of therapists and psychologists. Let's start with one. Do you think that they're coming for psychologists and therapists? And do you think that therapists in this, are going to be replaceable in the way that others? So that was one question, and then maybe we can come back to it. The other one is what you maybe think therapists, people in the psychology field who are interested in these issues, interested in social justice particularly, what particular role we might have in helping to develop a more socially just future based on some of the kind of analysis that you very eloquently described.
Okay. Yeah, two really good questions. Well, I think in the first one, I mean, there is no doubt that the robo counselor is coming, is already here. There are already a lot of online systems which do offer kind of therapy services, and indeed, I think you're seeing more and more of these kind of AI assistants and offering this kind of advice now. And there are some reports that people, actually find it quite helpful talking to a machine, whether you're actually talking or whether you're typing it or whatever. I mean, there are some actual robots, but that's perhaps you're going a bit far. But I think what you're going to see is this kind of interestingly, this sort of ability to listen. And machines are pretty good at that. They don't have all of those emotions and all of that ego interfering, or and then giving advice. Well, some of the things that you're looking for when you're kind of agitated or troubled, are pretty simple. They're not necessary. So I mean, even now, I don't know if you've been on Bing Copilot. You know, and I must say I had a bit of a conversation, and admittedly it was about my book. You know, because I was interested in how that came up and how did they link it to my songs and so on. And I have to say, after about 10 minutes of this, I came away thinking this is actually quite, you know, quite an interesting conversation, and it was very sort of positive. It was positive. I didn't realize I was the same person as I was talking about. Very narcissistic exercise, but it was interested in. It was positive in terms of me as a writer and songwriter, but it was also positive in me in terms of, you know, other things I can help you with. Is this the kind of thing you could be interested? Would you like to brainstorm that a bit more? So yes, I think there is a place already for a certain kind of online advice or therapy. You know, clearly, if to actually load up a piece of software with, you know, all of the symptoms of, you know, OCD or whatever, is pretty straightforward. And some people would say, of course, you know, cognitive behavior therapy that, you know, lends itself very well to digital therapy, and some you know, therapists who certainly in the past kind of saw themselves as scientists, as almost kind of white-coated you know, experts, you know, providing not a relationship as I think we would, you know, very much think about therapy, but just kind of scientific advice. Clearly that plays into the hands of online. So I mean, I think it's happening. The question is, are organizational decisions. You know, how is the NHS going to react to this? You know, when you're looking at a situation where you've got, I can't remember but something like over a million people on a waiting list for therapy. And you know, where is the money? Perhaps less money for that. The temptation to be able to say, well, certainly, you know, some of these will go online. We'll get, you know, a therapist after all, or well, not a therapist, but a machine, a digital system that's available 24/7, which is also quite interesting. That you're constantly potentially going to be, you know, referring to your online therapist. I think that's where you're going to see it. You might get a bigger distinction happening between private therapy, which I think is always going to be the most treasured type of therapy, but you know, NHS therapy or very low cost therapy, you know, may well. I
What
don't
do
know
you
what
think,
that means.
Michael? What do you think? I mean, somebody might say, well, you know, with things like CBT, that's great. It has loads of knowledge about OCD. It knows the symptoms. It knows what all the different treatments are. What do you think that? Do you think that there's something that a human therapist will be able to provide that AI would never? And what is that?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's the human connection. I think it's, you know, the shared experience of being human in a human world, and some of that, of course, is some of the almost the mistakes possibly that you know, the digital system can't make in terms of emotions, you know, are part of what's there in terms of a therapeutic relationship. And certainly, as I remember, you know, most of the evidence in terms of what clients value in a successful therapeutic relationship, it tends to be the relationship themselves. I mean, we as therapists get very obsessed with our models, you know, but actually, I think for a lot of clients, that's irrelevant to some extent. It's just a one-to-one
It's the
relationship.
relationship, and it's also a sense of being cared for, which by definition
Absolutely,
I
absolutely.
can't do.
And I think that, yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And I suppose that maybe leads on to the second part of the question. You know, in terms of how you can be, you know, relating to this issue, or perhaps becoming more aware of that kind of issue, more aware of you know, I mean, I suspect more, you know, if you are, clients will probably be coming up with that question. You know, should I be using an online therapist, or I am using an online system, and they say this, and you're saying that. You know, it may be that comes into, but I think it is an opportunity very much to be emphasizing, you know, the human aspect.
So I guess, Michael,
Of,
that second question was about, what do you think that therapists, psychologists, in resisting, in maintaining a more humanized and social just world, what do you see us as having any particular unique contribution to make? It sounds like part of what you're saying is working with our clients could be around kind of reminding them of that human connection, that human possibility. Is there other things that you think we could be doing?
but yeah, I mean, I think there is. I mean, I think it's partially drawing attention to this extraordinary choice which is now going on, which is, you know, are you human or are you machine? And you know, getting clients to think more about that, more about what their values are, and you know, to some extent, I think trying to debunk, demystify this whole notion about technology, that technology, yes, does it all for you. It does it all for you, but what is the cost of that? What is the cost in terms of what you're losing, in terms of your personal skills? So yeah, you start using AI to summarize, great. And then, you know, after 6 months, a year, you're asked to summarize without. Can you even do it? Do you even know how to go about that? Do you know how to go about brainstorming something? You know, and remember, of course, you know, some people are losing skills they've acquired over decades. Other people never have those skills, so they're going straight to summarizing through AI, or you know, a whole series of things which AI does already, you know, which they've never learned, and they go straight to. So I think it's thinking about that. Yes, you know, you might use, you know, there are some fantastic, I have to say, if someone interested in visual art, there are some extraordinary kind of, you know, image generators, you know, which can give you, you know, I don't know, you know, a picture of, you know, Humachines as is done by Picasso, or you know, abstract expressionist style, and, you know, give me 4 of those in 20 seconds, and, you know, they are extraordinary. But you've got to be thinking, you know, that's already eating away freelance visual designers. Or it's something like a 30% drop in one survey in terms of people come. So you see, I think it's asking people, you know, to be aware of the losses, both in terms of job losses to other people, because it all comes back in a sense. It may be a very different job to you, but it's the same kind of situation, you know, as your job. But also in terms of the de-skilling, because this is one of the biggest problems, I think, of kind of mass de-skilling of all, you know, every time a job or a task of a job is replaced or partially replaced by an AI, human skills are disappearing. And some of them absolutely fundamental. I mean, look what GPS has done to you know, the oldest, you know, quite possibly the oldest, or one of the oldest human skills of all, wayfinding. You know, those navigation skills, extraordinary skills, you know, which you know, enabled human beings to spread right across the world. You know, you see it in Australian Aboriginal people. I mean, there's still incredible ability to read an entire landscape, which to you know, other people, to moderns, is just nothing. For them, it's full of history, it's full of narratives, and so on. But you know, what's happening to us? You know, even getting around town. You know, in your own neighborhood, sometimes you can find yourself, you know, looking at the GPS. You know, whereas you used to have maps, we now just follow this voice, and the observational skills, or the observation experience of actually going through a landscape or going through a townscape are dropping, because all you're doing is focusing on the screen or focusing on the instruction. So you multiply that. Yeah, okay, it's maybe you multiply that across virtually every skill that you can think of, and even competences you never were aware that you had or anybody had. And again, I think that's quite interesting, almost that sort of itinerary, a logging of these skills, both personally and collectively. It's like trying to transcribe a language, before it disappears. And languages are, unfortunately disappearing all the time.
And I
But
guess
it's almost these skills are kind of indigenous, human competences. They come to a great extent with being human, but the danger is they simply disappear, and we have no access to them except through machines. So
And
again,
I guess,
yeah,
sorry, Michael, I guess one of the unique human, well, skills as a therapist and a psychologist is about relating. And perhaps when we ask the question about what is the unique contribution of psychologists here, therapists, is that we can hold that skill, we can remind people of the depth of connection and the importance of connection. We can be a memory for that incredibly important human capacity for deep communication that AI maybe can present but can never fully replicate by definition.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think again, I suppose it does kind of come back to jobs as well. And, I think increasingly there's going to be a lot of anxiety. There is anxiety already about jobs and what job should I go into? How do I hang on to my job? How am I going to cope if that job disappears? So I think there's a lot of kind of work around that, which I think will become increasingly important, because as I don't need to tell you, but I mean, people suffering kind of psychological troubles, it doesn't just come in some kind of
Yeah.
box or some kind of category which you can easily define. It's a whole world situation, and everything that's happening in the kind of political economy, I think is I think extremely.
Yeah, but I think, Michael, when I was reflecting on this question, I did a blog recently about can you have relational depth with the AI, and actually where I came to was the position that I think that, like you were saying earlier, maybe CBT, more kind of rules-based, technique-based therapies are replaceable. That there are potentialities for AI computing to do that. I think actually the kind of more humanistic therapies, the more relationship-based therapies, almost by definition, perhaps have more security because they're not replaceable by AI in the same way. And maybe, as I was saying earlier, there's something about holding on to that, being able to promote that, being able to really articulate those differences that you're talking about kind of not allowing those human existential relational qualities to be subsumed or presented by AI as something that it can just be kind of created and replicated, but actually that there is something very unique there. I guess what we need to do though is we need to understand something more deeply about what is human connection, what is relational depth, what is it beyond the series of behaviors or laws or processes that is always going to be beyond the reach of AI. I guess that's quite important academic work as well. In the in the poetry and the philosophy of people like Buber, I think there's that gives points towards ways that we might be able to do that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity in a sense. I mean, in some ways, it even relates to what some people in AI are trying to do, because for a while, people were saying the only safe way to have AI is to imbue AI with human values. which, okay, sounds kind of quite plausible, but what are those human values exactly? And which is actually one question. And I suppose the question is, if we came up with a definition of human values, would that necessarily ensure that AI was going to be benevolent rather than malevolent? In other words, there are some of the most terrible things that go on in the world go on the basis of are committed by humans who have particular belief systems which seem to justify that. I mean, you look at the news, look at what Trump's going, look at this terrible massacre that's happened today in Gaza. These are all kind of come under the category of human values. But in terms of having that discussion, which we're not having, because, and I think it's almost like the AI people have invited us in here to say, to have that role. It's an ideal role for psychologists generally, I think, to take that role. But I think also it's kind of it's the wider issue of a new political economy, based around, I think, based on a much closer ecological connection, based on a much greater community connection. And again, I suppose that can come down to issues around jobs, which I know I'm kind of obsessed with that, but I suppose that who can afford not to be, in the sense of how do you protect yourself? I think people are asking me increasing that question. What should I? Are there any jobs which are protected? Are there any jobs which And I think it's human to human jobs are much better. But I also think I will say to people, I think you need to start thinking not necessarily in terms of content of a job, but a form. In other words, what kind of organization do you want to be involved in? Because if you're stuck in any kind of hierarchical organization, I think you're going to be increasingly precarious. There are going to be more and more people at the top saying, "How do we cut that job? How do we cut that down?" And nowhere is more true of that than supposedly the most prized elite jobs in companies like Meta or Google, who are constantly cutting jobs. So I think we should be thinking of what kind of organization, maybe thinking in terms of much flatter organization, an organization which may be doing all sorts of things, but it's doing it on the basis that worker ownership, where leadership is co-leadership, and where you do have the ability actually to do one of the things that still human beings are better at than machines, which is a whole range of different tasks. I mean, that's what AGI is supposed to, the final puzzle it's supposed to solve. It hasn't yet. We've got lots of the AI that does lots of individual things, but you ask it to do something else, it doesn't have a clue. So we're still very good at generalizing. We're still very good at working across a range of things. So in a way, I think it's trying to get people to think, as I say, in terms of a different kind of structure to the pyramid structure, which plays completely into the hands of capitalism. And I think what we need to be doing is thinking, not helping capitalism reinvent itself, which of course is exactly what's happening. You have to hand it to it. It is brilliant at it. It's brilliant at coming up with new ways in which it can perpetuate itself, or seem to perpetuate itself. And what it's particularly good at, of course, is taking criticisms and turning them into liabilities and turning them into assets. So I think this whole issue of how do we stand up to what's going on shouldn't be a question of how can we kind of work the system which just plays into the hands of big tech. You might be made redundant from the practical issue is you are getting a lot of situations where automation comes up. So what do trade unions, if you've got a trade union, what do they ask for? What do they demand? And increasingly it's, we want training, first-class training for other jobs. So, well, what jobs exactly? That sounds very, very plausible, but what job? What job is going to actually, be around in 5 or 10 years? Most people say, we'll go into computer science, go into STEMs, but everyone's going into that. And, the reality is, already Gen AI is not only very, very good at writing songs, unfortunately, or painting pictures, it's very, very good at writing software. So you could be training as a software engineer and thinking, this is absolute, guaranteed job, only to find that, unless you have some real talent in this, machines are going to do it better. So I think, you need to be thinking in terms of a different kind of, demanding, if you're in that position, well, I want to be trained in organizational skills. I want to be trained in how to, if you like, a kind of horizontal forms of entrepreneurship. And ideally, I'd like the capital for a startup of this kind. If I'm going to give up my job without a fight. I think,
Michael, sorry to interrupt you. I'm just aware of the time and we're coming towards an end. But I mean, maybe what you're saying is there's something about also the potential for relational skills, and I think our conversation has come back to the importance of that. I mean, it's been fascinating what you've been talking about. There's so much there that I think that we could go on to unpack, and I'm sure people will find it really interesting to kind of listen to that and stimulate that. So do let us know your comments. Michael, thank you so much again. And I really encourage people to have a look at your book, The Age of Humachines. It's a really fantastic piece of work, and I think people will have heard how much there is to take away from that. So thank you, Michael.
Thanks very much,
good to talk to you.
Thank you, Mick, and good luck with the task podcast.
Thank you.